he doesn't go over any of this stuff. He says, look, lots of personification. That applies to John 1. Greetings and welcome to the beginning of wisdom. Today we are going to be looking at another video in our Scripture Verses series, looking again at something produced over at the Biblical Unitarian YouTube channel. The same one we've looked at before. They have, interestingly, over the last over 3 years, have not created any content there. The videos I responded to before were actually fairly old at the time, but I thought they warranted some consideration. Today we are looking at some brand new content they've put out. Recently a gentleman by the name of Dustin Smith has created a couple of videos. The clip I'm going to share with you today from their video, he kind of introduces himself, so I won't go into that right now. The entire argument, as you'll see, is basically that if you have personification happening in the Bible, if you have an example of this figure of speech, then you don't need to say that you have a person that you're actually talking about. It's not a person, it's whatever it is, and it's just being talked about like a person. And certainly in Proverbs that could very well be the case. There are scholars who come down on multiple sides of the issue on that, but the question or the argument of this video, as you'll see, is that it is basically just an example of a figure of speech, of personification, and there's nothing else you really need to see there, nothing else that needs to be addressed in terms of getting rid of what he calls the silly notion that there's a person in view in some of these other passages, perhaps Proverbs 8, but especially John 1, that it's just definitely a personification issue. So I'm going to let him kind of share his main argument. That's going to be followed by a bunch of scriptures. I'm going to go over some of the scriptures he gives, as well as a few others, just to clarify what exactly is being talked about. When we're done, you'll kind of see a few of the problems that I did see in the video.
Hey folks, how's it going? My name is Dustin Smith and I'm on the translation team here with the REV. And today we're going to talk about a very important subject in the Bible. We're going to talk today about personifications. Personifications. Now, a personification is where we can take an attribute and we give personality to it. And what we see in the Bible is that there are a lot of attributes of God. God's wisdom, God's word, God's prudence. And these things are often personified in order to give them personality and life. Now, they're used in poetic sections of the Bible. And so it's important for us to have a good handle on how the Bible is teaching us with these personifications, because there's a lot of trouble when it comes to passages like Proverbs chapter 8. Where Lady Wisdom speaks on her own. Or in a passage like John 1, where the word, the logos, gets described as a he. And some people, not understanding how a personification functions in Scripture, have falsely understood that Lady Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8 is an actual woman up there in heaven. Or that the logos is an actual person, a male, up there alongside with God. And that's just a silly misunderstanding that I hope that we can correct by looking at quite a few personifications in the Bible today. So we'll look at a lot of passages, a lot of scripture, and I hope you'll be able to keep up.
Okay, so as you can see, the argument is basically that if you have personification in a verse, and if you have lots of examples of personification, then that's going to somehow prove that seeing a person in a passage like John 1, in the Word, in the Logos, that is an actual person, that's just silly. And so what's interesting, if you watch his whole video, you'll see that after this section, lots of scriptures discussed, but then it just finishes up with saying, basically, see, it's lots of personification in the Bible, and John 1's the same as that. And that's really as deep as it goes. There's no real effort spent on John 1 to see why, to prove that is actually what's going on. It's basically just assumed. And the same is done really with Proverbs 8, that it's just assumed that this is an example of personification. Since we have other examples, it's just assumed that's what's going on here. So we're going to look at some of the passages, but before we do, I wanted to kind of go over a couple of the problems I see in this video overall. Number one is that it really just doesn't quite get personification right. There is a type of personification that basically takes something that's non-human, whether it's an abstract thing like an attribute, or whether it's an animal or an object or whatever, and it takes that thing and applies personal attributes or personal actions to it in a symbolic way. That's what he's basically getting at. But there are other ways of speaking symbolically that he is not really addressing here. And what those look like are just other types of examples where we move things around. So whereas personification, like he describes it, is something not personal being described like it is personal, well, what if you have something that's personal described like it's not personal? This has been called abstraction, or basically metaphorical language. Or what if you have kind of both going on at the same time, where you've got an actual person being described in non-personal ways and personal ways at the same time? Or as happens a lot in these citations he gives, maybe you have a person and then their attributes, and then their attributes are spoken of personally, which is what he mentions. But if you really look closely at the passage, it isn't talking about the attributes. It's bringing the attributes in a symbolic way. It's actually a person, in these cases God, who is being discussed. So as we look at these passages, that's going to be the first problem. The second problem is that this type of argument, the argument he's making, if you watch the video, it's really very weak. Like I mentioned, it doesn't really talk much about John 1, and the reason is that it's not actually an exegetical argument for his position. What it is something I call a word study defense. It's something that is very common among Unitarians, that they take, if there's a word or a phrase that's attached to God, and then it's also attached to Jesus, and it seems to indicate that Jesus is God, then one of the things they do is they will run everywhere all over the Bible looking for an example of something similar that was attached to God and Jesus being attached to others as well. And that therefore proves that it doesn't mean Jesus is God. The problem with that, there's a couple problems. Number one is a lot of them really get into this kind of argumentation thinking that it really proves Unitarianism, but all it really does is, the very best it can do is it can expose a bad argument for the Trinity. That doesn't disprove the Trinity, it doesn't prove Unitarianism. That's very best case scenario, and in most cases it doesn't really even do that. The reason for that is that if you have to jump away from the context of a passage and into other completely different contexts about other completely different things in order to get where you're going, then you run into problems. So we'll see that as well kind of at the end. But first I want to go over some of these passages. Some of these will be from the video, some will be not from the video, and I'll go over those as I do them. One point I do want to make is that I don't want to get into further arguments about the Bible version that he and his group are working on, that changes a lot of things in the Bible, and get into those kinds of discussions. So when I cite these passages, I'm not going to just be putting his quotes up there. I'm going to go ahead and cite a version of the Bible that's done by actual scholars that I can know and trust, and isn't something from a group that's pushing a certain type of theology. So I know there's no such thing as total neutrality. All translators have biases, but I'm going to go with something a little less biased than what they've created. So I will let you know when it is a passage he cites, and if you want to check the video for the differences, you can do that. But let's go ahead and take a look at the first one, and this is what I'm going to start with is actually a couple of examples where he does have personification just the way that he's describing it. So the first one I want to bring up is somewhere in the middle of the video. It says, and it's Psalm 85. I believe he just cites Psalm 85:10, but I'm going to give a little context to it because it is relevant. It is Psalm 85, 9 through 11. It says, "Surely his salvation is near for those who fear him, that glory may abide in our land. Loyal love and faithfulness will meet one another, righteousness and peace will kiss. Faithfulness will sprout from the ground, and righteousness will look down from heaven." So the verse, or the section there that he describes is in verse 10, right there in the middle. It says, "Loyal love and faithfulness will meet one another, righteousness and peace will kiss." So here we have these terms talking about meeting, kissing, like a lot of imagery of people coming together in harmony, in fellowship, in close, intimate relationship. But it's talking about love, faithfulness, righteousness, peace. These are blessings. These are things, these aren't people, obviously. So what is it describing? Well, the reason I included the context says in verse 9, "Surely his salvation is near for those who fear him." And this whole section here is talking about that salvation. It's talking about the blessings of it and personifying those blessings and saying, look at what, how, they come together, and all of the wonderful things about salvation will come together, just like, if you had a group of people, a family that was very close and that had been separated and were coming together as if in a reunion. So that's kind of what's going on. Absolutely a perfect example of just what Mr. Smith is talking about when it comes to personification. Let's take another look at another verse. Again, this is a good example. This is where what he's describing actually is what's in the text. This is Psalm 25:21. "Let integrity and uprightness preserve me, because I wait for you." And again, we have integrity and uprightness. These are attributes. And who are they attributes of? Well, from the context, I believe that these are talking about the psalmist, about the writer himself is saying, let it be that my integrity and my uprightness will preserve me, will help me to be okay, that my life will prosper and I will not be, killed or things like that. He says, "I wait for you," so he's not talking to integrity and uprightness. He's talking about them, but he's just saying, let them preserve my life. Let it be that I'm doing my best to follow you, Lord. Let that, preserve me and help me be good. Again, this is actually a good example of just the kind of personification he's talking about. So the next thing I want to look at kind of give us the flip side of this kind of metaphorical talk, and it's going to be very relevant as we look at other passages. So let's look at the passages first. The first one is Psalm 18, verse 2. It says, "Yahweh is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I have taken refuge, my shield and the horn of my deliverance, my stronghold." So here we have Psalm 18, verse 2, and it's talking about God, about Yahweh. And it describes him in all of these non-personal ways. He's a rock and a fortress, and so we see that it's not just that impersonal things are described in personal ways, but also the opposite is true, that personal beings like God are described in non-personal ways. And this is the metaphorical language that I was speaking of earlier. Now the next passage is going to, it builds on this same type of imagery, but this is from Proverbs chapter 18, verse 10. It says, "A tower of strength is the name of Yahweh. Into him the righteous will run and be safe." So here we have the same language, tower of strength, this military safety that's being discussed. And it's not describing Yahweh, it's describing the name of Yahweh. Now, the name of Yahweh is an attribute of Yahweh, but it's a strange one. It's not just saying, Yahweh be good to me. It's saying a tower of strength is the name of Yahweh. Now, obviously, if we took it literally, that would be silly. It would be silly to say that the 4 consonants that make up Yahweh in Hebrew is somehow a tower of strength. No, the obvious meaning of the text is that Yahweh is a tower of strength. If the righteous run to him for protection, they're safe. And the Hebrew's a little ambiguous here, whether it says into him or it, as the Hebrew could go either way. It's either saying him, Yahweh, or it, the tower of strength. Whatever it's talking about, the way we're to interpret it is to say Yahweh is the tower of strength. It is God. And so this phrase, the name of Yahweh, that is not literally speaking a personal being, is being used in this way. And this is actually very common in the Old Testament to speak of God's name this way. It says, God's name comes from afar, and God's name will be our refuge. And God says, I will put my name in the temple in Book of Deuteronomy, or in this place, in this city in Jerusalem. And there's just lots of different ways that the name of Yahweh is spoken of in a way that's very unusual if it was just speaking literally of a name. What is it we're taking refuge in? Well, we're taking refuge in himself. That's the point. And that is what we're going to see happening as we look at some of the other citations. I've got a couple more, and these are from his video. Again, this is a different version. This is a Lexham English Bible that I'm quoting, as opposed to their version, but let's take a look at a couple more. So these are from Mr. Smith's video. It says, the first one is Psalm 40, verse 11. It says, "As for you, O Yahweh, do not withhold your mercies from me. Let your loyal love and your faithfulness continually preserve me." So, again, we have this idea of preserving me, and this is the personification. This is the personality being brought out. And this time it isn't my actions, it's God. Your loyal love, your faithfulness, let them preserve me. Now, are we to take this, like we did in those other cases, are we to take it that the loyal love of God and the faithfulness of God are these impersonal attributes, and that we're just applying, this verb to preserve me as is what's symbolic? Do you think that the psalmist is asking, in talking about the preservation, is that symbolic, or is it something else? But if we just think about it for a moment, this is a prayer to God, and it's a prayer of preservation, and it's praying that that specific attributes would preserve me, preserve the one who prays. Well, isn't it just that he's praying that God would preserve him? And he's saying it in poetic language, and he's pointing out specific attributes of God to draw that picture. But he's not personifying attributes of God. Or if he is, there's a specific person he has in mind. He's saying, God, please preserve me. And we have this again in the next verse that he quotes. It's Psalm 61:7. Very similar. It says, "May he live forever in the presence of God," and the he is there is the King of Israel. "May he live forever in the presence of God. Appoint loyal love and faithfulness to preserve him." Again, same attributes and same prayer. This is a very important difference, because it's not just a situation You're just describing something that's impersonal and describing it metaphorically as if it were a person, but it's really not. What's really going on is there is a person here. There's God. And it's applying these attributes to God and praying for preservation, but speaking, what's the only thing that's really symbolic is it's as if the attributes are doing the action, but it's really God doing the action. So there is a person here, and that's what's going on. So the best way I can really describe this difference and why this is important is if you say, personification, like Dustin Smith says, and like does happen in some cases, is where the thing, the non-human thing, is what's real. And the personality, whether it's in action or description, is what's symbolic. What's going on in these passages, in most of them, is that the person is real. And in these cases, it's all God. God is real. God is the person being talked about. The actions, the personal actions, are also real because it's God. What's symbolic is speaking as if the attributes of God are doing the things when it's really just God himself doing those things. So we have all these different ways that the language works. Well, again, if you watch through to the end of his video, he doesn't go over any of this. He says, look, lots of personification, that applies to John 1. And so we don't really, it's just silly that they think that the word is a person. The second problem I really want to address is that this word study type of defense that is being mounted in this video, it really does fail to get to the heart of the issue. Again, he doesn't argue for his position that from any scholarly perspective, he doesn't argue for his position that Proverbs 8 is definitely personification, that Lady Wisdom is not a person in any sense, but rather must be just the personification of God's wisdom, just wisdom like you think of wisdom. And he doesn't argue for, in John 1, for the word being not a person. He doesn't do that. He just says, look, lots of personification going on, so it must be going on in John 1 as well. And he just fails to make any connection between the two. And that is often what you have when you look at this type of a defense, is that it just tries to basically cast doubt on it, but when you really get into the text itself and you actually get in the exegesis of the text itself, that's where this type of thing just falls apart in most cases. I have another video that I already did on John 1, responding to John Schoenheit from the same organization. I will link it up above and also in the description. And basically what it comes down to is just that when the Apostle John is writing and he says the word of, he says the word, he's not speaking literally as if plan or purpose even was a literal translation of logos. Look at John Schoenheit's argument in that other video. He gives you about 20 different ways that the word logos is translated, and basically by doing that seems to think that you can just pick the one you like, which is fallacious on another level. But basically he comes down on the view that word is plan and purpose, that word is God's plan and purpose. Well, nothing in the text says that. No, it just says logos. It doesn't say plan and purpose. He's not getting it from the passage itself. He's getting it from a preconceived, pre-committed theology, and that theology doesn't allow the logos to be a person. But if you look at that text in its own context and also ask, if this happens all the time, if a New Testament author uses a term and we don't really recognize it in our modern day, probably the best thing to do would be to look for it in the Old Testament to see if there might be a connection there. if you really look at the way that that the Apostle John is using this phrase, it begins to look a lot like several passages in the Old Testament, which I talk about in the other video, but I'll mention again briefly, that when in Genesis 15, when Abraham he meets the word of Yahweh, and so does Samuel in 1 Samuel 3, and so does Jeremiah in Jeremiah 1. And in these passages you see the word of Yahweh is there, and also you see that Yahweh is there. The two aren't necessarily equated. It doesn't say the word of Yahweh is Yahweh, but it's hard to pick out just who is doing what. First of all, the word of Yahweh appears over and over again in visions, which means that the word of Yahweh is not just a voice in an ear. It's something that was seen, and it does things that people do. It speaks. The word of Yahweh, he speaks, he takes Samuel out of, from where he was. I mean, there's all these different things that is said, and the word of Yahweh often shows up, and then Yahweh starts talking, and it's unclear if is this the same person we saw before, and there's an ambiguity. Well, the point is that these particular passages do speak of a person being called the Word, and that person being equated with God. And here we have John saying exactly the same thing in John 1. It's a lot more likely that those things are being connected than anything else. And when you look at those passages, and I've even heard John Schoenheit argue that, those passages and other places in not necessarily in the Old Testament as we have it, but in Aramaic translations called the Targums, a lot of times the word of Yahweh gets shoved in there where it isn't in the original Hebrew, in place of Yahweh himself. And Schoenheit argues, there's your personification. They're personifying the word in these actions of God. Well, no, because those are real actions. Those are a person is actually there. And the reason they're putting the word of Yahweh in there is because they believed that the word of Yahweh was a person. They believe that the word of Yahweh, in some passages, is just replacing Yahweh himself. Other passages, it's saying, God did it by the word, and they just threw that in there. There's a lot of different ways that it's doing it. Even at one point, I believe it's Joshua says, the word of Yahweh will be my God. And so, this isn't just personifying an attribute. This is a title for a person. And there is ample reason to believe that that is what John is drawing from when he pens the prologue to his gospel. What I recommend anyone do anytime you're looking at any kind of argument like this is go to the passage itself, read it in its own context. If you have to bring stuff in from all over the place about, in passages that don't have anything to do with what the author is talking about, there's a good chance that you're probably missing the point of what the author is talking about.